Welcome back. The New York Apartment Association promotes responsible housing policies to preserve affordable housing for future generations of New Yorkers. They seek to improve the relationship between housing providers and renters. Sitting with me in studio to discuss their fight is CEO of NYAA, Kenny Burgos. Kenny, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Now, can you tell me a little bit more about the mission of the New York Apartment Association?
Sure. The New York Apartment Association's main goal is to improve housing throughout New York City by improving it just for owners and also for renters as well.
Now, the NYAA is a new organization. Who started the idea, and how did NYAA become, to be?
Yeah. So we have a lot of long-term generational property owners that have been operating housing in the city of New York for decades, and they recognize now in recent times they want to be more engaging with government, with politicians, with community, with stakeholders, and so the mission is now to work in partnership with government again to improve housing across the city because there's a lot of issues at hand that we're facing, both in terms of affordability, in terms of development, in terms of just making overall neighborhoods better and improve.
Now, how is NYAA setting the industry standard for multifamily housing?
We work with thousands of owners and we make sure we uphold them to a higher standard to make sure that they're operating not only by all the proper laws and guidelines, but being sure that they're a model housing provider. We house literally hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers throughout the city. We want to make sure that we're providing the most quality and best possible housing throughout the city of New York.
Now, what are some of the most challenging, or what are some of the challenges New Yorkers face in regard to affordable housing? And I know this has been a long time issue for our city.
Long time is an understatement. New York City has been under a housing emergency for over 60 years. I don't know many emergencies that last that long, but quite honestly, the emergency is mostly attributed to lack of supply. Most experts suggest that we're short about 500,000 units of housing throughout the city, and that's going to help to bring rents down. It's a simple supply and demand issue. Other cities have done this and have actually seen their rents fall down, and New York City simply has to build more housing in order to drop the price of rents.
Now, I'm curious to know, as for me, I started hearing more about this kind of after the pandemic. That's where we saw a lot of that. Can you explain, although it's been 60 years, why are we now hearing about it so much more?
I think you're hearing it more because there was a really stark number that came out recently where the vacancy rate is where we always determine the housing emergency. Anything under a 5% vacancy rate is considered a housing emergency, again, which the city has had for 60 years. But we reached a 1.4% vacancy rate, which is just so ridiculously low. It essentially paints an image of any New Yorker looking for an apartment or housing right now is fighting for a low amount of tens of thousands of apartments throughout the entire city, which is just crazy.
Now, how does the NYAA feel about the City of Yes, and how will this help the housing crisis in NYC?
We're big supporters of the City of Yes. Like I said, the way to get out the housing crisis is to build. The City of Yes is probably the most, one of the boldest policies pushed forth by City Hall in decades to produce roughly about 80 to 100,000 brand new units of housing. But I told you the number before, we need is 500,000. So even the City of Yes alone won't solve this housing crisis because that plan is to build these housing units over 15 years. We need a lot more immediate results now.
Now, when it comes to housing in NYC, there are so many different layers. It's a very multi-layered issue.
Yeah.
How does your organization decide, what's the top priority to focus on?
Yeah, so for a lot of our members and our owners, we operate specifically in the rent-stabilized housing industry, and that is about roughly half the rental market. So most of our focus is in the rent-stabilized industry, but of course, housing is all interconnected. So we support good housing policy in any regard, but we focus mostly in the rent-stabilized world.
And with that, I don't know if this kind of relates to it as well, but when there are places that are available, a lot of New Yorkers just aren't making enough money to afford living in the city. How does the organization address that as well?
Yeah, I think affordability is the number one concern on every New Yorker's mind, whether it comes to food insecurity, whether it comes to housing, whether it comes to health insurance. So for us, one of our main policy goals is expanding voucher access. We have Section 8 vouchers at the federal government, city FEVS vouchers at the city level, and those have been helpful to help New Yorkers get housed and stay housed. But there's a lot more improvements, cutting a lot of bureaucratic red tape. I mean, if anyone's ever dealt with the voucher process, they know that this can be a years-long process, and sometimes your options are very limited. So our goal at NYA is to expand those options and also to expand access by working with government to improve it.
Now, how does NYAA or NYA plan to improve the relationship between housing providers and renters?
So we're doing that every day, but I think the way we're going to really build upon that is to show that we're part of the community, right? So many of our owners, beyond just being a housing provider, have been excellent neighbors and stakeholders in their communities for generations. Some of the ways we do that, we have owners who actually help with food pantries up in the Inwood section. We have food pantry every Saturday. I just was finished with them doing a turkey drive last week. And those are small ways to give back, but on top of that, working with local elected officials, working with local community stakeholders, seeing where we could be a partner beyond just a housing provider. I mean, we have members who, beyond someone just living in their building, have helped tenants apply for SCREE and DRE, apply for one-shot deals, helping them to stay in these neighborhoods. And I think building upon that legacy is going to help us have a much better symbiotic relationship with tenants and with property owners.
Now, I want to talk about property tax system. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and why it needs to be reformed?
We can talk all day on property taxes, but we have one of the most unequal property tax systems in New York City. And when it comes to rent stabilization, our owners are taxed at the full rate for property taxes, often taking about 30% of the rent check. And what happens, it's essentially a government tax that's pulling money away from that building. And that's why we're seeing so many buildings throughout the city fall into disrepair, because you have a regulated system that limits the income building can take in, but then you're also taxing it at the full amount, just unlike some other new buildings that receive property tax breaks, unlike other different property tax classifications. So the city really has to rework the property tax system to make it work for everyone.
Now, I know this may be kind of a loaded question, but it's been on my mind. Why does NYC have such a huge affordable housing crisis?
Well, again, it really does go back to supply. That's the main culprit here, but you tie in the supply issue with housing policy that's been happening for decades. I was a former state lawmaker, and I worked for many years to try and improve the housing scenario in New York State and New York City. But it's so complicated, it's so intertwined. This will take some time to remove that bureaucratic red tape, but when you have unfunded mandates that come down from city council, these costs add up and take away from potential operations of a building. You tie that in with inflation that we're seeing, you tie that in with people want to live in the city. It's the greatest city in the country, greatest city in the world. So that's a high demand. You have to meet that demand with the supply. So all these tools are needed to create a better housing scenario and really to increase affordability.
Now, what do you hope to see for the future, of this organization? As you mentioned, it's been 60 years. So,
Yeah.
I guess in the next 60, what do you hope to see?
My hope is New York City becomes a much more affordable city to live in and neighborhoods to live in. My hope is that our industry as a whole can come out of what is a very dark era right now. We have many buildings that may be falling into insolvency and disrepair. I don't like to say the sky is falling, but we have potential to look much like the 80s if we don't get on the right track right now. So my hope is to overall fix housing in New York City. Small goal.
And then what can, viewers or just the average New Yorker do to kind of help with this issue?
Sure. I would say tune into our social media channels at Housing NY. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, Blue Sky, you name it. And what we're doing every day is providing not only information on what we're pushing for in terms of good policy, but also sharing information what's going on in the news on a daily as it relates to housing policy in New York City and in New York State.
Well, Kenny, I want to thank you so much for joining us. This is definitely an issue I've seen just kind of unravel before me.
Yeah.
And just to hear that it's been going on for 60 years is quite alarming. So I'm so glad that you were here to kind of educate our community about this.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
To learn more about the NYAA fight, please go to their website at housingny.org. We have to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Open after this.